Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Post-secondary education in Canada is in trouble. Usually, when a Canadian college or university makes the news, it's for something good. For awards of excellence, or stories of student success, or groundbreaking research. But these days, lately, from coast to coast, our best schools are making headlines for another reason. Budgets are being cut, programs are being slashed, and staff are being laid off. What's happening to higher education in our country? I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, a funding crisis in post-secondary education. And nobody is talking about it. Chronic underfunding, coupled with the federal government slashing international student permits, is pushing schools to the brink. Schools from coast to coast are facing multi-million-dollar deficits and scrambling to stay afloat. What's going on? How did we get here? And what's the solution? For more on this today, I am joined by Elizabeth Buckner, Associate Professor of Higher Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Hi, Professor. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
So, what's going on here? It seems like every week, the last little while, a new college or university is making news because they're having to look at cutting staff and programs just to balance the budget and stay afloat. Are we looking at a crisis here in higher education? What's your sense of it?
Well, yes, I would say that it is a crisis for higher education, certainly. We are seeing unprecedented cuts to revenue. And there's simply no way for colleges and universities to make up on this dramatic shortfall in the short term or really in the long term. And so, yes, to answer your question, I would say the sector is facing a crisis.
It seems like a catalyst has been the immigration policy changes that the federal government made last year. The current plan will see 300,000 fewer international students over the next 3 years. Those permits are controlled by the federal government, and then the provinces allocate them to different universities based on population. Is there any plan to replace that revenue stream for colleges and universities? Because as I understand it, they were using the higher tuition that came in via these international students to offset permanent funding shortfalls. Can you explain how this change with international students has affected the fiscal health of these institutions?
Yes, you've summarized it very well. That's exactly what was happening. I mean, for decades, we've been underfunding our post-secondary system, and colleges and universities really turned to international students and the revenues that were associated with their tuition, where it's, important to realize international students are paying significantly more than domestic students in tuition, and they were using that in order to offset the sort of declining revenues that were coming from the federal and provincial levels. And so they're really dependent on international student tuition. And so the policy shifts that went into place in last year in 2024 were dramatic and sort of hood the rug out of colleges and universities. And I will say that this, it doesn't affect all universities and colleges equally. It doesn't affect every province equally. Ontario is particularly affected because of unique arrangements its college sector had. So really, Ontario colleges are by far the most affected. And there's just no way that the sector can make up for the lost revenue that they both have already lost and will continue to lose due to these caps. Because before this, I would say international students were making up the revenue. The tuition was probably something like a third of all total tuition revenue. In Ontario, it was in universities even higher, something like 2/3 of all tuition, even higher in the college sector. And so what we are hearing from the industry associations and organizations is that that Ontario's public universities are estimating to lose $1 billion over the next few years, and the college sector something closer to $3 billion over the next 2 years. And so these are just massive amounts that the sector is losing. And the only real options we have are essentially to step up provincial funding. And so, for example, Ontario has announced an increase, a one-time infusion, we can call it, of $1.2 billion, which sounds like a lot of money. But if you think the sector is actually losing $4 billion over the next few years, then $1 billion is not nearly enough. And it's also sort of a one-time stability funding without any continuity. And so the sector also is sort of concerned about the future. And so they're, and particularly colleges are drastically having to shrink their operations and their offerings, and there's no real solution.
Yeah, just this past week here locally, where I am in the nation's capital in Ottawa, for example, Algonquin College, which is my alma mater, and full disclosure for the listeners, I am a part-time professor there. I teach a class to journalism students. The college announced it's cutting 37 programs, 37 different programs, 16% of its total offering. And most of those staff will be laid off. We've offered buyouts to other staff. They've already shut down one of their 2 satellite campuses before this. All of that just to stay afloat. It speaks to the acute nature of the problem. And Elizabeth, what I think a lot of people may not understand is that there's no, as I understand it, there's no connection between the immigration policy and the funding formula for the schools. So the federal government has cut the number of permits available for international students, cutting the revenue flowing to schools, but the federal government doesn't make up that revenue, that difference, nor does the province. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So it seems like a bit of a disconnect there in the policy. Are people having those conversations? Is there a need to tie funding for schools to the number of permits available for international students, given that they're making up such a significant portion of the tuition revenue going into these schools?
That's a great question. I mean, I would sort of take a step back and really point out that these policy shifts were announced with with no advance notice and with no consultation with the sector and its representatives as a whole. And it really represents this massive about face on the part of the federal government. I mean, for decades, really, the federal government has said that Canada is a destination for international students. We have created a policy environment. We created a brand that the federal government was very involved in. We created an international education strategy first in 2014 and then again in 2019, where we're really affirming international education as a strategic export for Canada. And we're praising the huge billions of dollars of revenue that international education and students were bringing to not only the sector, but to local communities and supporting businesses. And we really tied our immigration pathways to education. We said we sort of said that we want international students. We set very high targets, and we said that our international students who came through the college and university system would be ideal immigrants. And that's really the phrase that we used. We aligned the policies to give preferential treatment to individuals who are graduating from our colleges and universities so that they sort of could get residency and stay. And then all of a sudden, in this, about face, the federal government rolled out these massive, highly disruptive changes to the immigration system. And it really did this with no consultation to the sector. And it took what I would say is really a sledgehammer approach rather than a chisel. The policy is one size fits all. It's cutting international students essentially by half. Technically 35%, but really, like in many institutions, it's closer to half of their international students are being cut, rather than recognizing that didn't need to happen. Not all provinces were recruiting nearly the same number of international students. Ontario was really an outlier. And so in many ways, the sort of other provinces are paying for the mistakes that Ontario made. And even within Ontario, I think some of the most egregious problems were happening by particular colleges, public-private partnerships that were happening with the public colleges and private providers that were really sort of unscrupulous, we can say, and they were just there weren't real caps on the huge number of international students they were accepting. And these are the places where we were seeing really dire consequences. But the rest of the sector was not impacted in the same way. And so I think that, at least, from my perspective, there's been the approach the federal government has taken. It has really penalized the whole sector. And just recently, in late 2024, they now have announced they're putting caps on graduate students as well, master's and doctoral students, which is, again, really short-sighted because we depend on our graduate students, even more than undergrads, in order to power sort of our future innovation systems. And so really what you see is that the federal government is in charge of immigration. And at the provincial level, the provinces are in charge of education. But and for years, there was coordination through this education to immigration pathway but now suddenly the federal government wants to wash its hands and say, we are not responsible for the fact that colleges in Ontario were acting sort of irresponsibly. But that implies as if we sort of all aren't going to pay the consequences. And I think that is short-sighted because we will pay the consequences if we underfund our post-secondary system and we have to massively close programs, and then we are preparing graduates for the labor market.
Yeah, and let me ask you about something that they call the death spiral. And this is a concern that's not specific to education. It's a concept that can be applied to a lot of public services. We hear about it a lot, for example, with public transit. But as an aside, the death spiral effect. Colleges and universities have to cut staff and programs due to lower funding levels, which makes them less competitive and less appealing to new students, which leads to more cuts, which leads to fewer students, which leads to more cuts, which leads ultimately to institutions closing. Are we at a risk of seeing mass closures of some of these institutions if there's no change to this funding crisis?
Well, I would say I don't think that there's going to be a death spiral effect in the short term, at least particularly not among the domestic student population. So domestic students are both, Canadian citizens and permanent residents. And, we still have a very high quality higher education system, and it plays a fundamental role in our society. And I think that at least among domestic student populations, the students, families, also employers, we all depend on the system. And there is still demand for credentials and degrees among domestic students. The problem is that domestic students, in some provinces, we've seen demographic declines. And so the domestic demand simply isn't enough to keep up the robust array of programs that colleges have been offering in particular. And so there is that's where we see concerns over a shrinking number of programs, but there's still demand for the education in general, for the credentials and whatnot. And, that's because, as we know, university degrees and college degrees translate into higher lifetime earnings and whatnot. So there is demand for them. And I don't think that that's going to change. But I think that the demand that is shifting is among the international audience and among international students. And so, as I mentioned, we've spent decades establishing ourselves as this international education destination and recruiting international students and promising this pathway. And so what this policy shift is doing is it's undermining Canada's reputation globally, because there are plenty of other countries that are willing to recruit international students and that we've long been competing for. And one of the distinct advantages that Canada always offered was that we did tie education to immigration opportunities and pathways, which is, really set us apart from the US and the UK, for example, which have long not done that. And so the concern is really that this policy is having a chilling effect. We hear stories about prospective international students literally not understanding what's going on because policies are shifting so fast and thinking that Canada no longer wants to recruit international students, or that we're not accepting, or that we're not open. And we're seeing, sort of delays in processing of visas. And so even the caps, the seats that the government has allocated to institutions in some cases aren't even being met. And that, I think, is an unintended consequence of the government policy. The government thought that, we'll set this lower cap, but at least that cap will be met. I think if in the long term we sort of are no longer seen as a desirable destination for international students, then we could see even more profound impacts. And so I think that there's both that international student demand. And so we have seen some of the sort of satellite campuses, you could call them the partnership campuses in Ontario colleges being shut down, but we haven't seen that among in really so much in the university sector or the main campuses of the colleges. And so, hopefully we won't see that. I do think there is the other place where we might be concerned about a death spiral, but more of like a slow moving train of a death spiral, is the long-term thriving of the sector as a whole, and particularly the college sector, because the college sector has traditionally provided concrete applied programs for the labor market. And if the domestic student population can't maintain demand for those programs, and so then we see huge numbers of them shutting down, then we may not be graduating enough students, individuals really, to fill in-demand positions with the technical skills that they need. And so I think that we have to ask, what are going to be the long-term consequences when colleges can't fund new innovative programs that are needed by employers, or when employers themselves can't find people to fill their vacancies because the sector simply isn't able to offer the programs or graduate enough people. And so I think that that's where I'm more concerned about the sort of long-term and second-order consequences.
Yeah, you've done a really good job of laying that out. The knock-on effects are staggering when you start to think about down the road a few years. Maybe not necessarily mass closures of institutions, but certainly a hollowing out of institutions, which we are already seeing. So more broadly, just because I think a lot of people don't really think about where the money comes from. How does a college or a university come up with its operating budget? So you have tuition, obviously, but then you've got direct, steady funding from, is it both provinces and the federal government? Can you give us a picture of what the revenue streams are, for example, a college or a university here in Ontario?
Yeah, I can. And again, Ontario is quite different from other provinces, and so it's important to talk about that there's really tremendous diversity across provinces and institutions, and the college sector and university sector are quite different from one another. So we have good data from Stats Can for right before this policy shift in 2022, 2023. And just sort of at the national level, universities' total revenue was about $47 billion compared to colleges' total revenue of $16 billion. So you can see that, universities have a lot more money, even just nationwide. And so the main difference between the two, universities do get funding from the federal government through research, tri-agency councils that fund research in the sciences, social sciences, and the health fields. And so roughly like 10% of funding comes directly from these federal streams that fund research, whereas colleges don't do nearly as much. They're not meant to be research-oriented organizations. They are teaching focused, and so they don't really, very small percentages of funding. And so the vast majority of public funding comes from their provinces. And although the funding that provinces give to their colleges and universities comes from block grants made by, from at the federal level, but they are sort of up to the provinces to spend on whatever they want. And so even if the federal government sort of hypothetically designated a particular percentage for post-secondary, provinces actually spend it however they want. And they're often competing with health, and sort of educational institutions are. And so, for example, Ontario spends much, much less on its post-secondary system than other provinces on a sort of per capita basis and as a percentage. And so that's partly what is going on. Is Ontario in particular has underfunded its higher education system for decades. And so so if you just take nationwide, the college sector, provincial funding accounts for 48% of all funding, compared to in the university sector, it's about 1/3, so 34% in the university sector. So colleges are more dependent on provincial funding than universities. And also in the college sector, tuition and fees made up about 38% of our revenue, compared to only 31% in the university sector, because universities also have other sources of revenue. They have endowments that they invest, and so they get some investment. They also have contracts with industry. They can also, use their spaces. And so, but all of this is really around the margins. And so the vast majority comes either directly from the provinces or from tuition. But I do think it's important to realize that that university funding is more diversified, and it's certainly not as dependent on either the province or the tuition and fees. And so what you have seen in particular in Ontario colleges is they're so dependent on the tuition and the province, but the province has been underfunding them. So really they looked to international student tuition more than any other province. And I think that it's important to realize that what else is going on in Ontario is that in 2019, the Ford government slashed domestic student tuition by 10% and then capped it. And it has been capped at those levels for the past 5 years. And so colleges have not been able to raise tuition on domestic students. And this is despite the fact that the sector, just like every other sector, is facing tremendous inflation and seeing salaries and other costs rise. And so they really were being pinched from all levels. And so that's, some colleges engaged in practices that were unscrupulous, I would say. But at the same time, you understand the constraints that they were under because they simply were not getting the public funding they needed.
It's such a double-edged sword. I remember in 2019 when the Ontario government moved to reduce tuition and then cap it. That was great. I was student aged at that point. Great. Tuition is frozen and it's predictable and it's less than I thought it was going to be. But at the same time, you don't have enough direct funding from the province coming in. The province has reduced your ability as an institution to recoup that funding by raising your tuition and fees. So what's left? It's relying on international students, which have now been capped by the federal government. So you're losing on all three sides here. So in closing today, what is the solution here? Something's got to give. Is it just funding, more public funding for colleges and universities? Are tuition rates going to have to increase substantially? Is it both? What's the outlook here? How do we get out of this predicament that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's what we're all asking. Not that there's one solution, but almost like, where do we go from here? I mean, I do think that in the short term, there is a real need to stabilize the revenue for the sector in order to just stem this sort of downsizing. And I think, I mean, that is coming from the provincial level. I mean, the federal government certainly hasn't offered the provinces money to do this. It should probably, given that it's really put into motion these major changes. But for example, Ontario's announced its one-time infusion, which is important and needed. But at the same time, I do think that we may need to look at tuition increases. I think raising tuition is part of the equation. I think that in general, Canadian higher ed is affordable and accessible, especially, when you take into account there are also scholarships available. And so in general, given no one wants to pay more, certainly, but given the actual cost of higher education and providing post-secondary, when you think of the huge costs for sort of at staff, but also buildings and whatnot, the tuition is currently quite affordable, and that increasing it, I'm in small percentages is going to help stabilize the sector. I think that the Ford government has said that it is not willing to lift its tuition freeze because it doesn't want to put more costs onto citizens, which I understand, but that's politically motivated decision. I really think that it's been 5 years now of frozen tuition, and it's kneecapping the sector. And I think that the long-term questions are also really important. I mean, I do think the sector has to engage in some self-reflection, particularly the college sector, around, does it need to return to a sort of more locally oriented mandate, because sort of this era of unbridled growth that was being fueled by international students really is over. And so what is the new mandate for the college sector going forward, especially recognizing that, I mean, the funding and the international students is only one of the crises the sector is going through. We also have, sort of AI changing the fundamental relationship between education and work, and many other issues that we are potentially facing. And so I think that there needs to be some self-reflection around the mandate. And then, I mean, I think the federal government needs to step up and take some more responsibility for the mess that it's made, because it's really created a lot of mistrust. I would say that the federal government says it's not responsible for the mess that it's created, but again, I think that's not true, and it's treated the sector as if it's not trustworthy, when for decades colleges and university have played like a really fundamental role in our societies, training people both for the labor market, but also for citizenship and engaged citizenship. And the sector is really crucial to the long-term goals of the country around innovation and our productivity crisis that we want to address. We're not going to be able to address that without a strong higher education system. And so I do think that the federal government needs to engage in more consultation with the sector to sort of think about changing some of these policies, rolling them back, and doing so, in close consultation with the sector, and trying to rebuild that trust, and also trying to rebuild the brand of Canada as an international study destination. So I think that there's sort of a lot that we need to do.
Okay, Professor Buckner, we'll have to leave it there for today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you as our guest. Really interesting discussion. I hope the listeners have enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
And again, that was Professor Elizabeth Buckner, Associate Professor of Higher Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. We thank her for her time today. And that was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode. Email us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on any of your other favorite podcast players. Please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Until next time, thank you for listening.